But in a courtroom, the only people who could testify about the operation of someone's mind are the people themselves who were participating.
Right, so we have the people, it's their judgment, it's their opinion.
Right.
Alrighty. So, we had just gotten done watching the last hearing, ran from like 9 or 10 to about 2. Now they're going to have an afternoon hearing where I believe Ambassador Volker and Tim Morrison is going to testify. Earlier today, they had Mrs. Jennifer Williams and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman testify. Now, I'm not exactly 100% keen on what Jennifer Williams' position is in the State Department, but Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman was, I guess, some sort of staffer for the National Security Council, and he ultimately was responsible for drafting policy points on paper, and then basically they get up to the President of the United States. But Tim Morrison was his immediate supervisor, and then it goes up to the ambassador, I believe, and then it finally gets to the president. So you have that. So anyway, again, the hearings from this morning, they literally didn't go anywhere, guys. This is just insane. I mean, Mrs. Williams, she was like, well, the call is kind of strange because, it involved the president asking the former president to investigate the vice president, and I did think that was kind of odd, but it wasn't like earth-shattering, and I didn't really felt compelled to tell anyone. So she testifies to the fact that she didn't tell anyone about it. Then on the other hand, you got Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and up until this point, I had no idea who this guy was, and apparently this guy, not only is he a national security, some sort of staffer. I don't know what position he is on behalf of the National Security Council, but he is a lieutenant colonel, and he works within that realm. And he there he is on the screen. Evidently, this guy, he's Ukrainian born. Okay, he's Ukrainian born. Immigrates to the United States at the age of 3.5. His father escapes the Soviet Union in the collapse thereof, and the formation, I guess, of the Baltics, or the countries within the Baltic region. And it grows up to become an American, and eventually, serves in the United States Army. And at this point, I'm not questioning his loyalty to the United States or even to the president. What I am saying is that now he becomes all things Ukraine. He has friends over there in Ukraine. He knows a lot about the policies and the procedures, the corruption and the things that are going on in Ukraine. And he's listening in on this phone conversation with the president of the United States and the president of Ukraine. And he hears that the president of the United States is going to withhold. He basically becomes aware of the fact that the president is going to withhold aid from Ukraine. Now, he doesn't know anything. That was never said in the phone conversation. That was never said. And to that fact, President Zelensky didn't even know that the aid was being withheld until like days after the fact, till it became public knowledge. So they didn't even know. So there couldn't have possibly been a quid pro quo to begin with. So now you don't have a quid pro quo, and now they're going with bribery. And the thing about bribery is, guys, So, as the constitutionalists or the founding fathers would have wrote bribery is is in the context that a foreign power would be able to basically purchase the president and have them serve at the will of the foreign power, not the other way around. You see how these Democrats are twisting it, right? They're saying that the president bribed these folks or are bribing these folks, as opposed to Ukraine bribing the president of the United States. Listen, if it was the other way around, and we're talking quid pro quos or briberies in their context, then almost every single request made by the president of the United States to a foreign power would essentially fit that bill. Because we are the most powerful country in the world. By their definition, they're saying that, oh, because we are so powerful and they're in such a weak position that if we hold aid, then they have to basically, they're at our beck and call because of the position that we find ourselves in. Then any request ever made by the president is basically could be construed as quid pro quos because they know by the same position, by that same definition. So it's absolutely freaking ludicrous that they would consider something like that. So I don't understand how they could get away with the charade anymore. I really don't. And in the fact, I'm kind of excited to listen to see, what Kurt Volker has to say, because evidently he was supposed to be real compelling, or he had a lot of information that he brought on when they deposed him behind closed doors. But I'll tell you what, this is becoming very, very irritating. And the reason why is because, again, in the last hearing, we hear Ranking Member Nunes questioning Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, and he says to him, "Well, who did you tell about the phone conversation?" And he says, "Well, I went to the National Security Council lawyers and I told them that I thought it was inappropriate and stuff like that." And he said, "Okay, well, who else did you tell?" And he said, "Well, I told the people in the conduct of my duties, through coordination and things like that." And he's like, "Okay, well, who did you tell?" And he's like, "Well, I told George Kent, and then I told one other person in the intelligence community." And he said, "Okay, well, which agency did he work for?" And then Adam Schiff says, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. No, we're not going down this path. We're not going down this path." So we now know, without a shadow of a doubt, where the information came and how the information got to where it went, right? I mean, this is huge. Had Adam Schiff kept his mouth shut, we would never know that was who the whistleblower was, right? But we know. All he asked was what agency, and he was like, so now we know without a shadow of a doubt, well, not without a shadow of a doubt, but we know fairly certain that Adam Schiff knows who the whistleblower is, knows that Vindman knows who the whistleblower is, and knows that Vindman was going to testify that he told a person who was the whistleblower who worked for a specific agency what was on the call. So before any of that could come to light, and before any of that could basically be said, Adam Schiff puts a stop to it, and he basically brings it to light himself. Because had Vindman just said, oh well, he worked for NSA or he worked for the CIA, no one would have thought of anything, and then he would have been like, well, what was the position that he did there? What was his name? Who was he? You know what I'm saying? So either way, which is funny because it would have come up and been like, CIA, who'd you tell? Oh, it was Eric Ciaramella. Oh, okay. And that would have been the end of it. But since we already know now how well, we don't know for a fact, but we pretty much know now that the information, we can speculate with a strong level of assertion that, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman basically was born in Ukraine, became a United States citizen, grew up in America, started to serve in the United States Army, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, found himself in a position where he was working and basically working for the State Department and pushing U.S. foreign policy and working with Ukraine. It had a strong affinity for where it is he came from, which there is nothing wrong with, and found out that the national aid was going to be withheld from Ukraine. Was very upset about the information he became aware of. Ran to the National Security Council lawyers, where nothing happened. Then he said, "Well, since nothing happened," he turns around. He goes and tells his friend at the CIA. He says, "Hey, listen, can can we do something about this?" He says, "Oh yeah, I'll just put in a whistleblower complaint, and." It'll be a done deal, And so he goes off. He talks to Adam Schiff's committee and the staffers thereof, or even possibly Adam Schiff himself. Puts in the complaint. He's covered underneath the Whistleblower Act. Oh, we got to protect his anonymity. Blah blah blah. Well, this is the reason why we got to protect the anonymity, because now we could track it all the way back. Basically, it started with Vindman, his affinity for Ukraine. He was upset about the aid being withheld. He wanted something done about it. So he runs off to the CIA operative who claims whistleblower anonymity, who says that there's wrongdoing on behalf of the President of the United States. And now we find ourselves into this big old deal where all of it basically boils down to is the fact that he was upset. And now, mind you, they're testifying to the fact that that Russia would have seen this as a weakening stance in U.S. and Ukraine relations. But the fact of the matter is that Russia would have never been made aware had the whistleblower not come forward, had Alexander Vindman, whatever the hell his name is now, I'm saying it 4 or 5 different ways, had he not said anything, had the Democrats not put on this charade. I mean, we're just airing our dirty laundry out there to the world, and we're just like, and the Democrats, there's Kurt Volker now coming in, so yeah, this is going to be exciting, I think. I think, and by the way, the Democrats was riding the fact that he showed up in his service uniform and all that. And I got to tell you something. Look, as a Marine vet, I could tell you that in the Marine Corps, you are absolutely required to wear your service uniform, your service alphas, if you're going to testify in front of Congress. Okay, in the conduct of your duties or your job, if you're going to go testify in front of U.S. Congress, you are wearing your service alphas. You're not wearing any other uniform. You're not wearing your camis. You're not wearing your, which we call them camis, utilities, BDUs, AD, or ACUs, or whatever branch you're in. You're not wearing that. You're wearing your service uniform. If for them to say, "Oh my God," for you to show up, we know you normally wear a suit. Yeah, the Army allows him to wear a suit because it would be very strange for him to walk the halls. It could be very strange for him to walk the halls, in a suit. The last student I was in, there were times where I went to certain agencies where I wore just a suit because it would be very strange for me to walk through the halls in the uniform of the day is what we would call it. So we would just put on a suit to kind of blend in with the rest of the folks. And it lends a little bit more credence to why we're there. So anyway, or a little bit more. It gives you a little bit more credibility. It just you match the rest of the folks, and people you're not really standing out like a sore thumb. So the fact of the matter is that he showed up in his service uniform is because he's required to by Army regulation. I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, soldiers out there. If I'm wrong, but I believe he is absolutely 100% required to show up in his service uniform. So for the Democrats to be going, "Oh my God, he showed up in his uniform," That's, that means, that tells us a lot about you and your service and your loyalty to the country. No, it doesn't. It just means that he's required to. So anyway, I don't believe that Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman is disloyal, disloyal lieutenant colonel to the United States in any way, shape, or form. I just believe he had an affinity for Ukraine. He knew that if the aid was withheld from Ukraine, it would put them in a bad position, especially against Russia, and that if the aid was withheld for an indefinite period of time or for any period of time, for any lengthy period of time, it could put Ukraine in a very bad position. So he wanted to do whatever he could to get that aid released, and be damned what president. And obviously he didn't like the president and the president's position on Ukraine. And then given the fact that Rudy Giuliani is now running around in the mix, asking questions about investigations of Biden and stuff like that. So there's a lot of people there that have a lot of questions. Let's see what he's got to say.
The chairman of the committee, Adam Schiff. One of the most significant moments in that hearing was during the opening statement by Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, where he talked about his father immigrating, bringing him from Ukraine, the former Soviet Union, some 40 years ago. And he said, here, you're able to sit at a witness table and speak truth to power, which is really what the essence was for Colonel Vindman's, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's testimony today, John. That's what they were trying to get at. Meantime, Democrats are going to emphasize that these witnesses, had direct custody of that call. There was a top Democratic aide who said, quote, this eviscerates the Republican argument that everything is coming in secondhand, thirdhand. And again, as I look across the way here, we're still waiting for maybe members to come back from the floor. I'm checking here to see if they have actually finished the vote on the House floor. We can definitely say that the bill is going to pass on the CR. We can definitely say that, but we don't have an actual vote total yet. But that would fund the government through the 20th of December, and it then would go to the Senate presumably in the next day or so, John.
All right, let's hope that on December 20th we don't find ourselves where we were at about the same time last year, where the government shut down, forcing the president to cancel his Mar-a-Lago vacation.
Some people are very worried about this.
Yeah. All right, Chad, keep a close eye on what's going on there. As we wait to hear from two more impeachment witnesses this afternoon, let's bring in Martha McCallum. She is the anchor of the story, and Andy McCarthy, former assistant U.S. attorney and a Fox News contributor. One of the main points about Kurt Volker is, Martha, that he was one of the three amigos, together with Gordon Sondland and Rick Perry, who was very much involved in this development of this irregular channel, as has been testified to by Bill Taylor, who was acting as the ambassador to Ukraine, as Rudy Giuliani was working together with Ukrainian officials. So what will the Republicans try to elicit from Volker, as they really wanted him to testify today?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a very delicate dance with both Tim Morrison and Kurt Volker, because they obviously want to protect themselves, but they were brought in as Republican witnesses. There was some reporting late last night in the New York Times that suggested that maybe Kurt Volker, who was the former envoy to Ukraine, that maybe he will try to distance himself from the other two amigos, that he will suggest that at times he was out of the loop when it came to the substance of what they were pursuing. So each one of these individuals, their first interest is their own self-preservation, John, and after that, perhaps they provide some sort of substance for Republicans. For releasing the aid, of course, Democrats think that was all for personal political gain.
And Andy McCarthy, Kurt Volker has testified already that he saw no proof of a quid pro quo, but if he today says, as Martha alluded to, that he was out of the loop at key moments during everything that was going on. I mean, we're not talking about a legal argument here. We're talking about a political argument. But can he say that there was no evidence of a quid pro quo if he wasn't in the loop all the time?
What I would expect, John, is that he will basically say, I can only answer to what I saw and heard, and he'll be on his guard not to draw any ultimate conclusions unless they lay a factual basis for him to have that kind of knowledge. I think he'll be particularly careful about that. My sense of looking at his original testimony is that he wanted to keep his distance from everything. He seemed to be one of these witnesses who was trying to be all things to all people and not do anything much controversial. I think along those lines, his approach more than likely is to be very, very conservative about what he can say, and if they don't lay a basis for him to know something, he won't go there.
All right. Special report anchor Brett Baer and Chris Wallace, the host of impeachment hearings. Earlier, we heard from two White House national security aides who listened in on that July phone call between President Trump and the leader of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, and described the call as, quote, inappropriate and unusual. Let's bring in our political panel. Joining me now, Fox News Sunday anchor Chris Wallace and our chief political anchor Brett Baer. Brett, you're in a unique position to give me some perspective on this as you covered both the Pentagon and the White House. Under questioning, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman said because of his military training, he thought that a request by President Trump to Vladimir Zelensky would be interpreted as an order. He was questioned by Congressman Chris Stewart about that. Let's listen to that and get your perspective on the back end of this.
When a superior officer asks for a favor of a subordinate, they will interpret that as a demand. Is that a fair synopsis of what you previously stated?
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, guys.
Is President Trump a member of the military?
Absolutely stupid.
He's not.
To take your reevaluation of their words based on your military experience and your military culture, and to attach that culture and that meaning of those words to someone who has never served?
Representative, I made that judgment. I stick by that judgment.
Okay, well, I got to tell you, I think it's nonsense.
So the comparison that he was making there, Brett, is all right. So you come from a military culture where a request could be seen as a demand, but this is politics.
So he says that he's a superior, right? So that he's a superior. When a superior makes a request to a I don't want to say inferior, but I guess a subordinate, and in this context, he's saying that the president of the United States is superior and the president of Ukraine is subordinate. Well, I got news for you. You shouldn't be anywhere near diplomacy if that's what you believe. If you believe that the president of Ukraine thinks that in some way, shape, or form that he is subordinate to President Trump, you're out of your mind. If President Zelensky doesn't hold himself to the same standards and the same strengths that he believes that President Trump comes from, or any president in the United States for that matter, then they can't play on the world stage. They have no business being on the world stage. And it's all about perception. It's all about projecting your perception and for other nations around you to see you as a strong, binding nation, a sovereign nation that's wealthy and has superior military might and is cohesive. Okay, great nations are cohesive. Their populations are cohesive. Like we are now, like the United States is now, we're very much in a very unstable position, much like the Roman Empire, and we could very easily fall from within, and this shaky ground that we're standing on right now, where we're divided and we can't really find ourselves any footing. People are calling each other names because they have a belief one way or the other and things like that. This is very shaky times, and all it takes is somebody just to kind of push us over, and we could very easily find ourselves in another civil war. We could, and you know who the benefactor to that is? There's a lot of them, but there's two right now that come to mind: China and Russia. So Russia's got a lot more to gain than China does. China has a lot more to lose, and I'll tell you why. Because we eat and buy up everything China makes. If we want something built, we go to China. We support China's economy. If all of us start fighting each other, maybe civil war might be good. Maybe we go overseas and we manufacture all of our guns and goods and weapons and stuff like that from China, and we buy it all up and stuff like that. Might actually be beneficial for China. I don't know, but either way, it isn't beneficial for the United States. And anybody who comes over into the United States, we got to be very cautious about what we read online and what other people tell us and what we perceive, and we got to look outside the box of of just the surface, okay? When people say perception is reality, that's a very, very simplistic, very, very narrow-minded way of thinking, because perception can very easily be warped and manipulated. Okay, perception has been warped and manipulated for hundreds of thousands of years through denial and deception and misinformation and psychological or psyop campaigns through the military, and by far more successful marketing and advertisers. Okay, your perception has been warped and manipulated by marketers and advertisers way better than any other military psyops or info campaign could ever warp your perception. So Russia is really good. They call it Maskirovka. Okay, so Maskirovka in Russia, which essentially means deception. Okay, so they're really good at it. So for me to say that they go into Ukraine and have these like sort of double agents working on behalf of the Russian Empire in Ukraine, you know, and all this corruption and stuff going on, isn't like some sort of like, you know, crazy conspiracy, guys. I mean, if you believe it's a crazy conspiracy, then you got no business watching any of this, and you really got no business having any opinion on the matter. And that's just really scary, because that just tells me that you have absolutely no world. You haven't really traveled the world at all. You haven't seen for yourself. You don't understand what it's like out there in the real world. And when I say in the real world, I don't mean like in hometown USA. I mean, you know, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in Asia, and South Asia. I mean, all these places are very, 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 very different, and they have very different cultures, and they have very different, you know, ways of doing things. And so, in the grand scheme of things, and I don't mean to say this to be to poke fun or make fun of any one culture, but I will. What I will say is that if you compare, let's say, the intelligence activities of the CIA to that of I guess it would be MI5. If you were to compare the two, I think that the human capacity, human intelligence collections capacity of MI5 is a little bit superior to the CIA in some aspects. And that is predominantly because the English is a little bit more flamboyant. And by that I mean it makes them good actors. So they can manipulate their culture in a way. They can sort of very easily meld into whatever situation or position that they find themselves in. It makes them good at manipulating themselves, manipulating others into believing who it is that they say they are, and that's through their culture. Americans tend to be more crass. They're not as fluesque, I guess, and we're more like in your face about things. There are some people that are a little bit more, you know, well, I can't even think of the word now. It's on the tip of my tongue, but, you know, a little bit more smooth, I guess, silver-tongued, I guess. That's the word I'm looking for. I guess in a way, the Brits have more of a silver tongue than Americans do, and Americans are more like, yeah, listen, this is the way it is. You like it or not. And then the Brits are like, you know, they'll say whatever they gotta say to you to make you believe that they're gonna do it, but they're not gonna do it anyway. And then when they don't, they'll tell you why they didn't do it, but it's because it's for your good. Anyway, that is just two different cultures. It's just two different ways of thinking. So.
Now, it's not to say, Martha, that there wasn't a quid pro quo, but if there was no mention of investigations during a very important meeting, what does that suggest?
Well, you know, John, I mean, it's interesting, and it goes to this issue of these two separate channels. I mean, when you look at the interactions that Vice President Pence had, it appears that none of these things were discussed in terms of the investigation or in terms of Burisma or Biden or any of that. You also have this letter that you and I discussed earlier today from Senator Ron Johnson, who says the same thing. He says that he met with Ukrainian officials several times during that June-July period and that nothing was brought up about withholding aid. He says that President Trump denied a quid pro quo to him and that in conversations with President Trump, he was very focused on corruption. So the interesting thing is that on that July 25th call, that's when those two worlds kind of collide, because the president on the phone with Zelensky and with these other people on the call for the first time kind of brings those two worlds together and brings up the issue of Biden and Burisma. He says it was just because he was dealing with corruption across the board. But of course, there's a lot of different opinions on that, as we've heard.
Right. And again, Tim Morrison, who will be one of the witnesses this afternoon, was on that July 25th call. So, but no doubt he will be asked what his impressions of that were. Andy McCarthy, as we get ready for the witnesses to come in, and here they come. There's Kurt Volker there. Again, the Republicans are going to try to make this pitch of where is the evidence for articles of impeachment. And there's Tim Morrison as well. Quickly, before we get gavelled in here, do you see any evidence? And again, I know it's a political, not a legal calculation.
No, I don't think that there's anything that approximates what Hamilton was talking about in Federalist 65 in terms of what the egregious kind of conduct that you should have to have an article of impeachment. But as Chris also pointed out, quoting Gerald Ford when he was minority leader of the House, he said an impeachable offense is anything the House of Representatives decides it is at a certain moment in history. If they want to be that cynical, they can go down that road.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the old adage of you could indict a ham sandwich with certain grand juries. Impeachment can be whatever you think it is at that time.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And I've been accused of indicting more than a ham sandwich in my day. But I do think that in all seriousness, this is something that ought to be a whole lot more serious than the kind of conduct that we have in front of us.
And that's where the whole political equation comes in, that this is so politically divided, and that the process of this more than anything is to bring in the American people and have them
Martha,
decide.
here we go as we start round two today.
The chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. There is a quorum present. We will proceed today in the same fashion as our other hearings. I'll make an opening statement, and then the ranking member will have an opportunity to make his opening statement. And we will turn to our witnesses for opening statements and then to questions. With that, I now recognize myself to give an opening statement in the impeachment inquiry into Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. This afternoon, we will hear from two witnesses requested by the minority, Ambassador Kurt Volker, the State Department Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and Tim Morrison, the former Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. I appreciate the minority's request for these two important witnesses, as well as Undersecretary of State David Hale, from whom we will hear tomorrow. As we have heard from other witnesses, when Joe Biden was considering whether to enter the race for the presidency in 2020, the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, began a campaign to weaken Vice President Biden's candidacy by pushing Ukraine to investigate him and his son. To clear away any obstacle to the scheme, days after the new Ukrainian president was elected, Trump ordered the recall of Marie Yovanovitch, the American ambassador in Kyiv, who was known for pushing anti-corruption efforts. Trump also canceled Vice President Mike Pence's participation in the inauguration of President Zelensky on May 20th, and instead sent a delegation headed by Energy Secretary Rick Perry, Ambassador to the EU Gordon Sondland, and Ambassador Kurt Volker. These three returned from Kyiv and briefed President Trump on their encouraging first interactions with the new Ukrainian administration. Hopes that Trump would agree to an early meeting with the Ukrainian president were soon diminished, however, when Trump pushed back. According to Volker, he just didn't believe it. He was skeptical, and he also said, "That's not what I hear. I hear, he's got some terrible people around him." President Trump also told them he believed that Ukraine tried to take him down. He told the three amigos, "Talk to Rudy." And they did. One of those interactions took place a week before the July 25th phone call between Trump and Zelensky, when Ambassador Volker had breakfast with Rudy Giuliani at the Trump Hotel. Volker testified that he pushed back on Giuliani's accusation against Joe Biden. On July 22nd, just days before Trump would talk to Zelensky, Ambassador Volker had a telephone conference with Giuliani and Andrei Yermak, a top advisor to the Ukrainian president, so that Giuliani could be introduced to Yermak. On July 25th, the same day as the call between President Trump and Zelensky, but before it took place, Ambassador Volker sent a text message to Yermak. Quote, heard from the White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate/get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for a visit to Washington. Good luck, exclamation point. Later that day, Donald Trump would have the now infamous phone call with Zelensky, in which he responded to Ukraine's appreciation for U.S. defense support and a request by President Zelensky to buy more Javelin anti-tank missiles by saying, I would like you to do us a favor, though. And the favor involved the two investigations that Giuliani had been pushing for into the Bidens in 2016. Ambassador Volker was not on the call, but when asked about what it reflected, he testified, no president of the United States should ask a foreign leader to help interfere in a U.S. election. Among those listening in on the July 25th call was Tim Morrison, who had taken over as the NSC's senior director for European affairs at the NSC only days before, but had been briefed by his predecessor, Fiona Hill, about the irregular second channel that was operating in parallel to the official one. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Williams, from whom we heard this morning, like them, Morrison emerged from the call troubled. He was concerned enough about what he heard on the July 25th call that he went to see the NSC legal advisor soon after it had ended. Colonel Vindman's fear was that the president had broken the law, potentially, but Morrison said of his concern that his concern was that the call could be damaging if it were leaked. Soon after this discussion with lawyers at the NSC, the call record was hidden away on a secure server used to store highly classified intelligence, where it remained until late September when the call record was publicly released. Following the July 25th call, Ambassador Volker worked with Sondland and the Ukrainian president's close advisor Yermak on a statement that would satisfy Giuliani. When Yermak sent over a draft that still failed to include the specific words Burisma and 2016, Giuliani said the statement would lack credibility. Ambassador Volker then added both Burisma and 2016 to the draft statement. Both Volker and Morrison were, by late July, aware that the security assistance had been cut off at the direction of the president and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. As the Ukrainians became aware of the suspension of security assistance and the negotiations over the scheduling of a White House meeting between Trump and Zelensky dragged on, the pressure increased and any pretense that there was no linkage soon dropped away. Morrison accompanied Vice President Pence to Warsaw on September 1st, where Pence and Zelensky met, and Zelensky raised the suspended security assistance. Following that meeting, Sondland approached Yermak to tell him that he believed that what could help move the aid was if the Ukrainian prosecutor general would go to the mic and announce that he was opening the Burisma investigation. On September 7th, Ambassador Sondland had a telephone call with Trump and asked him what he wanted from Ukraine. According to Morrison, who spoke with Sondland after the call, Trump insisted that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky must personally announce the opening of the investigations, and he should want to do it. Sondland also said that if President Zelensky didn't agree to make a public statement about the investigations, the U.S. and Ukraine would be at a stalemate, meaning it would not receive the much-needed security assistance. Morrison had a sinking feeling after the call, as he realized that the ask was now being directed at Zelensky himself, and not the prosecutor general, as Sondland had relayed to a senior Ukrainian aide in Warsaw on September 1st. While President Trump claimed there was no quid pro quo, his insistence that Zelensky himself must publicly announce the investigations, or they'd be at a stalemate, made clear that at least two official acts, a White House meeting and $400 million in military aid, were conditioned on receipt of what Trump wanted, the investigations to help his campaign. The efforts to secure the investigations would continue for several more days, but appear to have abruptly ended soon after the three committees of Congress announced an investigation into the Trump Giuliani-Ukraine scheme. Only then would the aid be released. I now recognize Ranking Member Nunes for any remarks he would like to make.
Welcome back to Act 2 of today's circus, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to continue what the Democrats tell us is a serious, somber, and even prayerful process of attempting to overthrow a duly elected president. If they're successful, the end result would be to disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans who thought the president is chosen by the American people, not by 13 Democrat partisans on a committee that's supposed to be overseeing the government's intelligence agencies. And isn't it strange how we've morphed into the impeachment committee, presiding over a matter that has no intelligence component whatsoever? Impeachment, of course, is the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee, not the Intelligence Committee. But putting this farce in our court provides two main advantages for the Democrats. It made it easier for them to shroud their depositions in secrecy, and it allowed them to avoid giving too big of a role in this spectacle to another Democrat committee chairman in whom the Democrat leaders obviously have no confidence. Who can possibly view these proceedings as fair and impartial? They are being conducted by Democrats who spent 3 years saturating the airwaves with dire warnings that President Trump is a Russian agent. And these outlandish attacks continue to this very day. Just this weekend, in front of a crowd of Democratic Party activists, the chairman of this committee denounced President Trump as a profound threat to our democracy and vowed that we will send that charlatan in the White House back to the golden throne he came from. How can anyone believe that people who would utter such dramatic absurdities are conducting a fair impeachment process and are only trying to discover the truth? It's obvious the Democrats are trying to topple the president solely because they despise him, because they've promised since Election Day to impeach him, and because they're afraid he will win re-election next year. No witnesses have identified any crime or impeachable offense committed by the president, but that doesn't matter. Last week, the Democrats told us his infraction was asking for a quid pro quo. This week, it's bribery. Who knows what ridiculous crime they'll be accusing him of next week. As witnesses, the Democrats have called a parade of government officials who don't like President Trump's Ukraine policy, even though they acknowledge he provided Ukraine with lethal military aid after the Obama administration refused to do so. They also resent his conduct of policy through channels outside their own authority and control. These actions, they argue, contradict the so-called interagency consensus. They don't seem to understand that the president alone is constitutionally vested with the authority to set the policy. The American people elect a president, not an interagency consensus. And of course, our previous witnesses had very little new information to share in these hearings. That's because these hearings are not designed to uncover new information. They're meant to showcase a hand-picked group of witnesses who the Democrats determined through their secret audition process will provide testimony most conducive and conducive to their accusations. In fact, by the time any witness says anything here, people are actually hearing it for the third time. They heard it first through the Democrats' cherry-picked leaks to their media sympathizers during the secret depositions. And second, when the Democrats published those deposition transcripts in a highly staged manner. Of course, there are no transcripts from crucial witnesses like Hunter Biden, who could testify about his well-paying job on the board of a corrupt Ukrainian company, or Alexander Chalupa, who worked on an election meddling scheme with Ukrainian officials on behalf of the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. That's because the Democrats refused to let us hear from them. As for evidence, what we're left with is the transcript of the Trump-Zelensky phone call, which the president made public. That means Americans can read for themselves an unremarkable conversation with President Zelensky, who repeatedly expressed satisfaction with the call afterward. The Democrats, however, claim President Zelensky was being bribed, and therefore he must be lying when he says the call was friendly and posed no problems. There's some irony here. For weeks, we've heard the Democrats bemoan the damage President Trump supposedly caused to the U.S.-Ukrainian relations. But when the Ukrainian president contradicts their accusations, they publicly dismiss him as a liar. I may be wrong, but I'm fairly sure calling a friendly foreign president, newly elected, a liar violates their so-called interagency consensus. So overall, the Democrats would have you believe President Zelensky was being blackmailed with a pause on lethal military aid that he didn't even know about, that President Trump did not mention to him, and that diplomats have testified they always assumed would be lifted, which it was. Without the Ukrainians undertaking any of the actions they were supposedly being coerced into doing. This process is not serious, it's not sober, not prayerful.
I just want to point
It's an
out
ambitious attack to
that
deprive
if
the
you
American people of the right
seriously
to elect a president the Democrats
put
like.
down a timeline. I'm working on a timeline right now in my blog
As I mentioned,
on
Chairman of
American
this committee
Overwatch.
claims that democracy
And
is
if you
under
see the
threat.
video and you're not already a member,
If that's true,
sign up,
It's
subscribe,
not the president who poses
and you'll get
danger.
the blog. But
Yield back.
I'm working on a timeline
Thank you,
now,
gentlemen.
so that way you can
We're joined this
understand
afternoon by Ambassador Kurt Volker
when
and
the
Mr.
Democrats
Timothy
do the
Morrison.
information and
Ambassador
where they
Kurt
release
Volker
the
served in
information.
the U.S. Foreign
and when
Service for
things are
nearly
done.
30 years,
So
working on European and Eurasian political
it's hilarious.
and security issues under 5 different presidential administrations. During the
During
George W. Bush
administration, he served as the acting director for European and Eurasian Affairs in the National Security Council and later as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. In 2008, President Bush appointed Ambassador Volker to the United States Permanent Representative to NATO, where he served until May 2009. In July 2017, Ambassador Volker was appointed to be the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, serving in that position until he resigned in September. It is a pleasure to welcome Mr. Morrison back to the legislative branch, where he served for almost 2 decades as a Republican staffer. He was a professional staff member for Representative Mark Kennedy of Minnesota and Senator John Kyle of Arizona. Later, Mr. Morrison served as the longtime policy director for the Republican staff of the House Armed Services Committee. In July 2018, Mr. Morrison joined the National Security Council as Senior Director for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction. Following the departure of Dr. Fiona Hill in July 2019, Mr. Morrison assumed the position of Senior Director for Russia and Europe. 2 final points before the witnesses are sworn. First, witness depositions as part of this inquiry were unclassified in nature, and all open hearings will also be held at the unclassified level. Any information that may touch on classified information will be addressed separately. Second, Congress will not tolerate any reprisal, threat of reprisal, or attempt to retaliate against any U.S. government official for testifying before Congress, including you or of any of your colleagues. If you would both please rise and raise your right hand, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. The microphones are sensitive, so please speak directly into them. Without objection, your written statements will also be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Morrison, you are recognized for your opening statement, and immediately thereafter, Ambassador Volker, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunez, and members of the committee, I appear before you today under subpoena to answer your questions about my time as Senior Director for European Affairs at the White House and the National Security Council, as related to Ukraine and U.S. security sector assistance to that country. I will provide you the most complete and accurate information I can, consistent with my obligations to protect classified and privileged information. Whether the conduct that is the subject of this inquiry merits impeachment is a question for the U.S. House of Representatives. I appear here today only to provide factual information based upon my knowledge and recollection of events. I will not waste time restating the details of my opening statement from my deposition on October 31, 2019, which has recently been made public. However, I will highlight the following key points. First, as I previously stated, I do not know who the whistleblower is, nor do I intend to speculate as to who the individual may be. Second, I have great respect for my former colleagues from the NSC and the rest of the interagency. I am not here today to question their character or integrity. My recollections and judgments are my own. Some of my colleagues' recollections of conversations and interactions may differ from mine, but I do not view those differences as the result of an untoward purpose. Third, I continue to believe Ukraine is on the front lines of a strategic competition between the West and Vladimir Putin's revanchist Russia. Russia is a failing power, but it is still a dangerous one. The United States aids Ukraine and her people so they can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. Support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty has been a bipartisan objective since Russia's military invasion in 2014. It must continue to be. As I stated during my deposition, I feared at the time of the call on July 25th how its disclosure would play in Washington's political climate. My fears have been realized. I understand the gravity of these proceedings, but I beg you not to lose sight of the military conflict underway in eastern Ukraine today, the ongoing illegal occupation of Crimea, and the importance of reform of Ukraine's politics and economy. Every day that the focus of discussion involving Ukraine is centered on these proceedings instead of those matters is a day when we are not focused on the interests Ukraine, the United States, and Western-style liberalism share. Finally, I concluded my active service at the National Security Council the day after I last appeared before you. I left the NSC completely of my own volition. I felt no pressure to resign, nor have I feared any retaliation for my testimony. I made this career choice sometime before I decided to testify on October 31st. I'm prepared to answer your questions to the best of my ability and recollection.
Thank you. Ambassador Volker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide this testimony today. As you know, I was the first person to come forward to testify as part of this inquiry. I did so voluntarily, and likewise voluntarily provided relevant documentation in my possession in order to be as cooperative, clear, and complete as possible. I am here today voluntarily, and I remain committed to cooperating fully and truthfully with this committee. All I can do is provide the facts as I understood them at the time. I did this on October 3rd in private, and I will do so again today. Like many others who have testified in this inquiry, I'm a career foreign policy professional. I began my career as an intelligence analyst for Northern Europe for the Central Intelligence Agency in 1986, before joining the State Department in 1988. I served in diplomatic postings primarily focused on European political and security issues for over 20 years under Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. My last three positions before leaving the Senior Foreign Service in 2009 were as Director for NATO and West European Affairs at the National Security Council, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the State Department, and finally, as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. In the spring of 2017, then Secretary of State Tillerson asked if I would come back to government service as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. I did this on a part-time, voluntary basis with no salary paid by the U.S. taxpayer, simply because I believed it was important to serve our country in this way. I believed I could steer U.S. policy in the right direction. For over 2 years, as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, my singular focus was advancing the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. In particular, that meant pushing back on Russian aggression and supporting the development of a strong, resilient, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine, one that overcomes a legacy of corruption and becomes integrated into a wider transatlantic community. This is critically important for U.S. national security. If we can stop and reverse Russian aggression in Ukraine, we can prevent it elsewhere. If Ukraine, the cradle of Slavic civilization predating Moscow, succeeds as a freedom-loving, prosperous, and secure democracy, it gives us enormous hope that Russia may one day change, providing a better life for Russian people, and overcoming its current plague of authoritarianism, corruption, aggression toward neighbors, and threats to NATO and the United States. The stakes for the United States in a successful Ukraine could not be higher. At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden. As you know from the extensive real-time documentation I have provided, Vice President Biden was not a topic of our discussions. I was not on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. I was not made aware of any reference to Vice President Biden or his son by President Trump until the transcript of that call was released on September 25th, 2019. From July 7, 2017 until September 27th, 2019, I was the lead U.S. diplomat dealing with Russia's war on Ukraine. My role was not some irregular channel, but the official channel. I reported directly to Secretaries of State Tillerson and Pompeo, kept the National Security Advisor and Secretary of Defense well informed of my efforts, and worked closely with Ambassador Masha Yovanovitch, NSC Senior Director Hill and her successor Tim Morrison, then Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell and his successor, Acting Assistant Secretary Phil Reeker, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper, NSC Director Alex Vindman, and many, many others. I have known many of them for several years. It was a team effort. When Ambassador Yovanovitch left Kyiv, I identified and recommended Bill Taylor to Secretary Pompeo, so we would still have a strong, seasoned professional on the ground. For 2 years before the events at the heart of this investigation took place, I was the most senior U.S. diplomat visiting the conflict zone, meeting with victims of Russia's aggression, urging increased U.S. security assistance, including lethal defensive weapons, working with Ukrainian President Poroshenko and then his successor, President Zelensky, and their teams, working with France and Germany in the so-called Normandy process, pressing for support from NATO, the EU, and OSCE, supporting the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission, and engaging in negotiations and other contacts with Russian officials. At the time I took the position in the summer of 2017, there were major complicated questions swirling in public debate about the direction of U.S. policy toward Ukraine. Would the administration lift sanctions against Russia? Would it make some kind of grand bargain with Russia in which it would trade recognition of Russia's seizure of Ukrainian territory for some other deal in Syria or elsewhere? Would the administration recognize Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea? Will this just become another frozen conflict? There were also a vast number of vacancies in key diplomatic positions, so no one was really representing the United States in the negotiating process about ending the war in eastern Ukraine. During over 2 years of my tenure as U.S. Special Representative, we fundamentally turned U.S. policy around. U.S. policy toward Ukraine was strong, consistent, and enjoyed support across the administration, bipartisan support in Congress, and support among our allies and Ukraine. We changed the language commonly used to describe Russia's aggression. I was the administration's most outspoken public figure, highlighting Russia's invasion and occupation of parts of Ukraine, calling out Russia's responsibility to end the war. I visited the war zone 3 times, meeting with soldiers and civilians alike, always bringing media with me to try to raise the public visibility of Russia's aggression and the humanitarian impact on the lives of the citizens of the Donbass. We coordinated closely with our European allies in Canada to maintain a united front against Russian aggression and for Ukraine's democracy, reform, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Ukraine policy is perhaps the one area where the U.S. and its European allies had been in lockstep. This coordination helped to strengthen U.S. sanctions against Russia and to maintain EU sanctions as well. Along with others in the administration, I strongly advocated for lifting the ban on the sale of lethal defensive weapons, or at least the defensive arms to Ukraine, advocated for increasing U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, and urged other countries to follow suit. My team and I drafted the Pompeo Declaration of July 25th, 2018, in which the Secretary clearly and definitively laid out the U.S. policy of non-recognition of Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea. I engaged with our allies, with Ukraine and with Russia in negotiations to implement the Minsk agreements, holding a firm line on insisting on the withdrawal of Russian forces, dismantling of the so-called People's Republics, and restoring Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Together with others in the administration, we kept U.S. policy steady through presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine and worked hard to strengthen the U.S.-Ukraine bilateral relationship under the new president and government, helping shepherd in a peaceful transition of power in Ukraine. So in short, whereas 2 years ago, most observers would have said that time is on Russia's side, by 2019, when I departed, we had turned the tables, and time was now on Ukraine's side. It's a tragedy for the United States and for Ukraine that our efforts in this area, which were bearing fruit, have now been thrown into disarray. One of the critical aspects of my role as U.S. Special Representative was that as the most senior U.S. official appointed to work solely on the Ukraine portfolio, I needed to step forward to provide leadership. If we needed to adopt a policy position, I made the case for it. If anyone needed to speak out publicly, I would do it. When we failed to get a timely statement about Russia's illegal attack on Ukraine's Navy and seizure of Ukraine's sailors, I tweeted about it in order to condemn the act. If a problem arose, I knew it was my job to try to fix it. That was my perspective when I learned in May 2019 that we had a significant problem that was impeding our ability to strengthen our support for Ukraine's new president in his effort to ramp up Ukraine's fight against corruption and implementation of needed reforms. I found myself faced with a choice: to be aware of a problem and to ignore it, or to accept that it was my responsibility to try to fix it. I tried to fix it. The problem was that despite the unanimous positive assessment and recommendations of those of us who were part of the U.S. presidential delegation that attended the inauguration of President Zelensky, President Trump was receiving a different negative narrative about Ukraine and President Zelensky. That narrative was fueled by accusations from Ukraine's then Prosecutor General and conveyed to the president by former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. As I previously told this committee, I became aware of the negative impact this was having on our policy efforts when 4 of us, who were part of the presidential delegation to the inauguration, met as a group with President Trump on May 23rd. We stressed our finding that President Zelensky represented the best chance for getting Ukraine out of the mire of corruption it had been in for over 20 years. We urged him to invite President Zelensky to the White House. The president was very skeptical. Given Ukraine's history of corruption, that's understandable. He said that Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said, "They tried to take me down." In the course of that conversation, he referenced conversations with Mayor Giuliani. It was clear to me that despite the positive news and recommendations being conveyed by this official delegation about the new president, President Trump had a deeply rooted negative view on Ukraine rooted in the past. He was receiving other information from other sources, including Mayor Giuliani, that was more negative, causing him to retain this negative view. Within a few days, on May 29th, President Trump indeed signed the congratulatory letter to President Zelensky, which included an invitation to the president to visit him at the White House. However, more than 4 weeks passed, and we could not nail down a date for the meeting. I came to believe that the president's long-held negative view toward Ukraine was causing hesitation in actually scheduling the meeting, much as we had seen in our Oval Office discussion. After weeks of reassuring the Ukrainians that it was just a scheduling issue, I decided to tell President Zelensky that we had a problem with the information reaching President Trump from Mayor Giuliani. I did so in a bilateral meeting at a conference on Ukrainian economic reform in Toronto on July 2nd, 2019, where I led the U.S. delegation. I suggested that he call President Trump directly in order to renew their personal relationship and to assure President Trump that he was committed to investigating and fighting corruption, things on which President Zelensky had based his presidential campaign. I was convinced that getting the 2 presidents to talk with each other would overcome the negative perception of Ukraine that President Trump still harbored. President Zelensky's senior aide, Andriy Yermak, approached me several days later to ask to be connected to Mayor Giuliani. I agreed to make that connection. I did so because I understood that the new Ukrainian leadership wanted to convince those, like Mayor Giuliani, who believed such a negative narrative about Ukraine, that times have changed, and that, under President Zelensky, Ukraine is worthy of U.S. support. Ukrainians believe that if they could get their own narrative across in a way that convinced Mayor Giuliani that they were serious about fighting corruption and advancing reform, Mayor Giuliani would convey that assessment to President Trump, thus correcting the previous negative narrative. That made sense to me, and I tried to be helpful. I made clear to the Ukrainians that Mayor Giuliani was a private citizen, the president's personal lawyer, and not representing the U.S. government. Likewise, in my conversations with Mayor Giuliani, I never considered him to be speaking on the president's behalf or giving instructions. Rather, the information flow was the other way, from Ukraine to Mayor Giuliani, in the hopes that this would clear up the information reaching President Trump. On July 10th, after hearing from Mr. Yermak, I wrote to Mayor Giuliani to seek to get together, and finally on July 19th, we met for breakfast for a longer discussion. At that meeting, I told Mr. Giuliani that in my view, the prosecutor general with whom he had been speaking, Mr. Lutsenko, was not credible and was acting in a self-serving capacity. To my surprise, Mayor Giuliani said that he had already come to that same conclusion. Mr. Giuliani also mentioned both the accusations about Vice President Biden and about interference in the 2016 election, and stressed that all he wanted to see was for Ukraine to investigate what happened in the past and apply its own laws. Concerning the allegations, I stressed that no one in the new team governing Ukraine had anything to do with anything that may have happened in 2016. They were making television shows at the time. I also said that it's not credible to me that former Vice President Biden would have been influenced in any way by financial or personal motives in carrying out his duties as Vice President. A different issue is whether some individual Ukrainians may have attempted to influence the 2016 election or thought they could buy influence. That is at least plausible given Ukraine's reputation for corruption. But the accusation that Vice President Biden acted inappropriately did not seem at all credible to me. After that meeting, I connected Mayor Giuliani and Mr. Yermak by text and later by phone. They met in person on August 2nd, 2019. In conversations with me following that meeting, which I did not attend, Mr. Giuliani said that he had stressed the importance of Ukraine conducting investigations into what happened in the past, and Mr. Yermak stressed that he told Mr. Giuliani it is the government's program to root out corruption and implement reforms, and they would be conducting investigations as part of this process anyway. Mr. Giuliani said he believed the Ukrainian president needed to make a statement about fighting corruption and that he had discussed this with Mr. Yermak. I said I did not think that this would be a problem since that is the government's position anyway. I followed up with Mr. Yermak, and he said that they would indeed be prepared to make a statement. He said it would reference Burisma and 2016 in a wider context of bilateral relations and rooting out corruption anyway. There was no mention of Vice President Biden. Rather, in referencing Burisma and 2016 election interference, it was clear to me that he, Mr. Yermak, was only talking about whether any Ukrainians had acted inappropriately. At this time, I was focused on our goal of getting President Zelensky and President Trump to meet with each other. And I believe that their doing so would overcome the chronically negative view President Trump had toward Ukraine. I was seeking to solve the problem I saw when we met with President Trump in the Oval Office on May 23rd. As a professional diplomat,
So he has absolutely no ground.
About its own intentions to investigate possible corruption that would be helpful in convincing Mr. Giuliani to convey to President Trump a more positive assessment of the new leadership in Ukraine. On August 16th, Mr. Yermak shared a draft with me, which I thought looked perfectly reasonable. It did not mention Burisma or 2016 elections, but was generic. Ambassador Sondland and I had a further conversation with Mr. Giuliani, who said that in his view, in order to be convincing that this government represented real change in Ukraine, the statement should include specific reference to Burisma and 2016. Again, there was no mention of Vice President Biden in these conversations.
Ambassador Sondland and I discussed these points, and I edited the statement drafted by Mr. Yermak to include these points to see how it looked. I then discussed it further with Mr. Yermak. He said that for a number of reasons, including the fact that Mr. Lutsenko was still officially the Prosecutor General, they did not want to mention Burisma or 2016. I agreed, and the idea of putting out a statement was shelved. These were the last conversations I had about this statement, which were on or about August 17 to 18. My last contact with Mr. Giuliani, according to my records, was on August 13th, until he tried to reach me on September 20th after the impeachment inquiry was launched. At this time, that is to say, in the middle of August, I thought the idea of issuing this statement had been definitively scrapped. In September, I was surprised to learn that there had been further discussions with the Ukrainians about President Zelensky possibly making a statement in an interview with U.S. media similar to what we had discussed in August. Since these events, and since I gave my testimony on October 3rd, a great deal of additional information and perspectives have come to light. I've learned many things that I did not know at the time of the events in question. First, at the time I was connecting Mr. Yermak and Mr. Giuliani and discussing with Mr. Yermak and Ambassador Sondland a possible statement that could be made by the Ukrainian president, I did not know of any linkage between the hold on security assistance and Ukraine pursuing investigations. No one had ever said that to me, and I never conveyed such a linkage to the Ukrainians. I opposed the hold on U.S. security assistance as soon as I learned about it on July 18th, and I thought we could turn it around before the Ukrainians ever knew or became alarmed about it. I did not know the reason for the hold, but I viewed it as a U.S. policy problem that we needed to fix internally, and I was confident we would do so. I believe the Ukrainians became aware of the hold on August 29th and not before. That date is the first time any of them asked me about the hold by forwarding an article that had been published in Politico. When I spoke to the Ukrainians about the hold after August 29th, instead of telling them that they needed to do something to get the hold released, I told them the opposite, that they should not be alarmed, it was an internal U.S. problem, and we were working to get it fixed. I did not know others were conveying a different message to them around the same time. Second, I did not know about the strong concerns expressed by then National Security Advisor John Bolton to members of his NSC staff regarding the discussion of investigations. I participated in the July 10th meeting between National Security Advisor Bolton and then Ukrainian Chairman of the National Security and Defense Council, Alex Danylyuk. As I remember, the meeting was essentially over when Ambassador Sondland made a general comment about investigations. I think all of us thought it was inappropriate. The conversation did not continue, and the meeting concluded. Later on, in the wardroom, I may have been engaged in a side conversation or had already left the complex because I do not recall further discussion regarding investigations of Burisma. Third, I did not understand that others believed that any investigation of Ukrainian company Burisma, which had a history of accusations of corruption, was tantamount to investigating Vice President Biden. I drew a sharp distinction between the two. It has long been U.S. policy under multiple administrations to urge Ukraine to investigate and fight internal corruption. I was quite comfortable with Ukraine making its own statement about its own policy of investigating and fighting corruption at home. At the one in-person meeting I had with Mayor Giuliani on July 19th, Mayor Giuliani raised and I rejected the conspiracy theory that Vice President Biden would have been influenced in his duties as Vice President by money paid to his son. As I previously testified, I have known Vice President Biden for 24 years. He is an honorable man and hold him in the highest regard. At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden. As you know from the extensive documentation I provided, Vice President Biden was not a topic of discussion. I was not on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky, and I was not made aware of any reference to Vice President Biden or his son by President Trump until the transcript of that call was released on September 25th, 2019. Throughout this time, I understood that there was an important distinction between Burisma and Biden, and I urged the Ukrainians to maintain such a distinction. I did not know that President Trump or others had raised Vice President Biden with Ukrainians, or had conflated the investigation of possible Ukrainian corruption with investigation of the former vice president. In retrospect, for the Ukrainians, it would clearly have been confusing. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Fourth, much has been made of the term Three Amigos in reference to Secretary Perry, Ambassador Sondland, and myself. I've never used that term and frankly cringe when I hear it, because for me, the Three Amigos will always refer to Senator McCain, Senator Lieberman, and Senator Graham in reference to their work to support the surge in Iraq. Moreover, I was never aware of any designation by President Trump or anyone else putting Ambassador Sondland or the three of us as a group in charge of Ukraine policy. Rather, as I understood it, each of us in our own respective official capacities continued to work together after our attendance at President Zelensky's inauguration to push for greater U.S. support for Ukraine. Leading the diplomacy around Ukraine negotiations had long been my official responsibility, but I welcome the added support and influence of a cabinet member and our EU ambassador. Fifth, I was not aware that Ambassador Sondland spoke with President Trump on July 26th, while Ambassador Taylor and I were visiting the conflict zone. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, allow me to thank you again for the opportunity to provide this testimony.
What a long conversation or intro.
Ukraine are of critical importance.
Holy
and I'll be
crap.
pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your opening statements. We'll now proceed to the first round of questions. As detailed in the memo provided to committee members, there'll be 45 minutes.
45 minutes.
Conducted by the chairman or majority counsel, followed by
What does it bring us to 6, 7, 8?
or minority counsel.
Jesus.
Following that, unless I specify additional equal time for extended questioning, we'll proceed under the 5-minute rule, and every member will have a chance to ask questions. I now recognize myself or counsel for the first round of questions. Ambassador Volker, I was going to just yield to the minority counsel, but there are a couple points that you made in your opening statement that I wanted to ask about first. First, you said that now former Attorney General Lutsenko was not credible. Mr. Lutsenko is the author of a number of allegations against Ambassador Yovanovitch, a number of allegations that were shared with John Solomon of the Hill, a number of allegations that have been repeatedly brought up by my Republican colleagues. Why is it that you found Mr. Lutsenko not credible and told Mr. Giuliani so?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, the allegations themselves, including those against Ambassador Yovanovitch, did not appear to me to be credible at all. I know her to be an incredibly competent professional, someone I've worked with for many, many years. The suggestions that she was acting in some inappropriate manner were not credible to me. I've known Vice President Biden for a long time. Those accusations were not credible. And then separate from that, I also was aware of the political situation in Ukraine. We had a situation where President Poroshenko appeared to not be in a favorable position going into the elections, where it was increasingly apparent then candidate Zelensky was going to win. As is often the case in Ukraine, a change in power would mean change in prosecutorial powers as well. And there have been efforts in the past at prosecuting the previous government. I think Mr. Lutsenko, in my estimation, and I said this to Mayor Giuliani when I met with him, was interested in preserving his own position. He wanted to avoid being fired by a new government in order to prevent prosecution of himself, possible prosecution of himself. Possibly also this is something that President Poroshenko would have welcomed as well, because he probably would have avoided any efforts to prosecute President Poroshenko as well. So by making allegations like this and making sure they were reaching U.S. media, I think that Mr. Lutsenko was trying to make himself appear to be an important and influential player in the United States.
Ambassador, let me also ask you about the allegations against Joe Biden, because that has been a continuing refrain from some of my colleagues as well. Why was it that you found the allegations against Joe Biden related to his son or Burisma not to be believed?
Simply because I've known former Vice President Biden for a long time. I know how he respects his duties of higher office, and it's just not credible to me that a Vice President of the United States is going to do anything other than act as how he sees best for the national interest.
And finally, Ambassador, before I turn it over, I was struck by something you said on page 8 of your statement, which reads, "In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect," you said, "I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections." What is it now, Ambassador, in retrospect, that you recognize that you didn't at this time that leads you to conclude that you would or should have raised these objections?
Yeah. That others did not see the distinction between these things as I saw it. As I said, there is a history of corruption in Ukraine. There's a history with the company of Burisma that's been investigated. That is well known. There is a separate allegation about the vice president acting inappropriately. His son was a board member of this company, but those things I saw as completely distinct. And what I was trying to do in working with the Ukrainians was to thread a needle to see whether things that they can do that are appropriate and reasonable as part of Ukraine's own policy of fighting corruption that help clarify for our president that they are committed to that very effort. If there's a way to thread that needle, I thought it was worth the effort to try to solve that problem. As it turns out, I now understand that most of the other people didn't see or didn't consider this distinction, that for them it was synonymous.
Well, one of those people who saw it synonymous turns out to be the President of the United States. I take it you didn't know until the call record was released that the president in that call doesn't raise Burisma. He asked for an investigation of the Bidens. Is that right?
That is correct.
I take it, since you say that you acknowledge that asking for an investigation of the Bidens would have been unacceptable and objectionable, that had the president asked you to get Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, you would have told him so?
I would have objected to that, yes, sir.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one follow-up on that, Ambassador Volker. When you say thread the needle, you mean that you understood the relationship between Vice President Biden's son and Burisma, but you were trying to separate the two of them in your mind. Is that right?
Well, I believe that they were separate. This references the conversation I had with Mr. Giuliani as well, where I think the allegations against Vice President Biden are self-serving and not credible. Separate question is whether it is appropriate for Ukraine to investigate possible corruption of Ukrainians that may have tried to corrupt things or buy influence. To me, they are very different things. And as I said, I think the former is unacceptable. I think the latter in this case is.
Understood. But you understood the relationship between Hunter Biden and Burisma.
I knew that he had been a board member of the company, yes.
Let's go back.
That's why it was so important to maintain a distinction.
Let's focus on the July 25th call for a moment. And Mr. Morrison, July 25th was day number what for you as the senior director overseeing Ukraine?
I officially took over on the 15th, approximately 10 days, very few days actually in the office.
You testified in your deposition that you received an email on the morning of July 25th from Ambassador Sondland shortly before the call. Is that right?
Yes.
And I believe in that email, Ambassador Sondland told you that he had briefed President Trump about in advance of the call. Is that right?
Yes.
And you also testified that Ambassador Sondland had told you on another occasion that he could call the president whenever he wanted. Is that right?
Yes.
And on July 25th, did you in fact make an effort to confirm whether or not the phone call between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump actually occurred?
I did.
And did it happen?
Yes.
On other occasions, when Ambassador Sondland told you that he spoke with President Trump, on some other occasions, did you also seek confirmation of that fact?
On some, yes.
And on those occasions when you did seek to confirm that they had spoken, what did you find?
They had.
Now I'm going to pull up a text message on the morning of July 25th it should be another one. Ambassador Sondland with you, Ambassador Volker. And at 7:54 in the morning, Ambassador Sondland says, call ASAP. Then at 9:35, Ambassador Volker, you respond. Is the screen working in front of you or just to the side? Yeah. So if you could go ahead and read what you said.
Yes.
At 9:35.
Yes, so I say, hi, Gordon, got your message. Had a great lunch with Yermak and then passed your message to him. He will see you tomorrow. Think everything is in place.
And who is Yermak?
Andriy Yermak is the senior advisor to President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Now, what was the message that you had received?
That President Zelensky should be clear, convincing, forthright with President Trump about his commitment to fighting corruption, investigating what happened in the past, get to the bottom of things, whatever there is.
It's just another goat rope, guys. Another goat rope show. So I'm gonna end it here, and we'll see what you guys think. I can't do it anymore. Oh God.
Wasn't sure whether he had or not. He, as Mr. Morrison just said that he does speak with President Trump. I knew that he had conversations.